interesting, but there's not a lot of time to fit all of this stuff in, but I hope that I can do it justice, at least to give a cursory overview of this emerging field. So here's the overview I want to give of the talk that I'm going to give you now. This is what I want to cover. First thing I want to do is look at first principles, obviously. I mean, I say first principles, we could probably take this way, way back further, to ancient Greece, where they seem to have had all of these debates already. But I'll just go back to the 18th century with Paley and Hume. Then I want to think about the difference between organicism and mechanism, and how they might relate to psychical research. Then I want to hopefully show how this line of reasoning works by applying some organic principles to the paranormal. And I want to do that specifically by looking at my kind of fieldwork experience and how an organic perspective on it might give us new avenues for investigating things like mediumship and spirit possession. And then at the end of the talk, I want to briefly look at the relationship between the paranormal more broadly and nature connection. And I'll round off with thinking about animism and how the paranormal might help us in some ways to build a new relationship with the environment and tackle the eco-crisis. So not much, but here we go. So here we go. Paley and Hume. It's not actually that often that I find myself agreeing with David Hume, because he's a very, empirically minded fellow, and he rejects a lot of claims to the paranormal, perhaps in like a, throwing the baby out with the bathwater kind of way. But there is one thing that I do agree with him on, and that is his kind of critique of William Paley. So I don't know if many of you know about William Paley, but he's the guy who came up with the, the Watchmaker argument for the existence of God. And he said, if we look at the world around us, we see, plants and animals and all of these kinds of things living together. And it's almost as though, it was designed by a creative God. And he gave the analogy, if you were walking along a beach and you stumbled across a watch, you'd look at it, you'd see the intricate mechanism and all that kind of stuff, and you think someone must have made this. And one of Hume's critiques of this argument was actually that if we look at the world, we don't see something that resembles a mechanism or something that's been put together by people. What we see is something much more organic. And I've got a nice quote from him here. I'll just read it out for you. So he says, the world plainly resembles more an animal or a vegetable than it does a watch or a knitting loom. Its cause, therefore, it is more probable, resembles the cause of the former. The cause of the former is generation or vegetation. The cause, therefore, of the world we may infer to be something similar or analogous to generation or vegetation. So really what he's talking about is, he's saying that the world is complex, but when we really look at it up close, it's not complex in the way that a watch mechanism is, so where we can clearly tell that pieces have been designed and shaped and positioned. What we're looking at is something much more organic. I think really what he's kind of getting at quite early on is the idea of, evolution and that kind of thing, that, these things change over time. So I thought this was an interesting distinction to make, between a mechanistic view of the world on the one hand and an organistic view, organistic, however you want to call it, organic view of the world. So I've been exploring what an organic perspective might tell us, when we apply it to the paranormal. And that's what this talk is about. Okay, so just to think about some of the differences between organicism on the one hand and mechanism on the other hand. We've got a nice little illustration here. We've got a mechanism here with, cogs and gears and things like that. It's very ordered. And like William Paley said, if we look at this, then we would think that someone has put it together, because they have. So a mechanistic worldview is quite ordered. It's usually a materialist worldview as well. So they're basically saying that matter is the building blocks of existence, and essentially then that we can reduce everything down to matter in order to explain it. On the other hand, we've got the more organic perspective. So when we look at organisms, we see lots of component parts, kind of working together in kind of like a self-sustaining relationship. So, if we look at a cell, for example, everything in the cell works together essentially for the benefit of the whole. So an organicist view is much more kind of, it's much less reductive, I suppose is the best way of putting it, much more interested in complexity and the kind of bigger picture. And you might notice here, I'll just put these things, so, an organic perspective is much more holistic, and it sees the whole as important. So, cells and stuff work together to produce a whole organism. So it's kind of like a little bit more cooperative as well. Whereas the mechanistic view thinks, the best way to understand the world is to break it down and look for the cogs, basically, the component parts. So this is broadly, the big differences between organicism and mechanism. I can't go into too much detail about it because I've got a lot to get through, but hopefully it'll become much more easy to understand as we go through. Okay, so I want to think about how these ideas have been applied in psychical research and parapsychology. So in terms of mechanism, we go back to the Industrial Revolution, the Victorians. This is when spiritualism really started to kick off. And they were very keen on trying to understand the world through the lens of the new technologies that they'd developed. And one of the things that they were really interested in, especially in the kind of spiritualist milieu, was the idea of a spiritual telegraph. So, what they're doing then is taking a model or an analogy from technologies, from newly emerging technologies, and applying them to understand the paranormal world of mediums and spirits and that kind of stuff. So in that sense, they're applying, a technological, mechanistic framework for understanding the paranormal. Another example might be the idea of, the brain as a computer. This is quite common, or was quite common a few years ago in neuroscience, although it's becoming increasingly more, not really an idea that is tenable, to put it politely. But it was popular, and I think it's had a big influence in parapsychology, and especially in ideas about the brain as kind of like a receiver, so ideas about non-local consciousness and all that kind of stuff, where the brain functions as a machine that picks up signals that are being sent from somewhere. So again, it's the application of a technological metaphor for understanding the paranormal or a spiritual phenomenon. And then I think if we want to take it a little bit further, we can say that the direction that parapsychology took after psychical research, in the 1930s with J.B. Rhine, it took a reductionist turn. Whereas the psychical researchers had investigated, paranormal events like haunted houses, poltergeists and stuff in the field holistically, parapsychologists in the 20th century started to break things down into small parts that they could understand statistically in laboratory settings. So I think, if we're going to think about it quite broadly, then modern parapsychology is also employing this kind of mechanistic, maybe, reductionist way of thinking about the paranormal and about psi in particular. So that's just a few ways that mechanism has been applied to psychical research. And I think you could broadly argue that, in terms of popular conceptions of science and the mind and that kind of stuff, this is the worldview that most people, in the popular world subscribe to in the West. But there's always been this parallel strand. So if we look at psychical research again, and in particular, there's a lineage that we can trace through these kinds of thinkers. We go to people like Charles Richey. He was a Nobel Prize-winning physiologist, so he's a psychical researcher who comes from the realms of biology, and it's from him that we get terms like ectoplasm and pseudopods and stuff, which, if we just go back to this one, you can see these are terms from cellular biology that have been taken from cellular biology and applied into the paranormal. So they're applying biological ideas to understand the paranormal rather than technological and mechanistic. Hans Driesch in the middle was a German biologist but he was also interested in search. And he came to be a proponent of vitalism, which is there is in living things a kind of vital life force that's what makes, you know, life or living things different from inanimate things. And then Rupert Sheldrake is probably a more recent example. You know, his ideas about morphic fields, and he himself comes from a biochemical background, so he's drawing on more biological, physiological kind of models for understanding the paranormal. Okay, so this is just one example of this kind of parallel lineage, but I think this might be the kind of, you know, if we're going to weigh it up of whether we're going to go down a reductionist, mechanistic way or an organicist, holistic way, I think this is the direction that I'm certainly heading in. So it's just a little summary of what these guys, you know, the contribution that these guys made to an organicist parapsychology. Charles Richey with his ideas drawn from cellular biology, ectoplasm, pseudopods. Hans Driesch with his idea that paranormal phenomena like materializations and stuff in seances could be understood as what he called super extensions of normal physiological processes. So, you know, like embryology and all of that kind of stuff, and how cells change and develop. He thought that these were basically super extended versions of that. And then Rupert Sheldrake's ideas about morphogenesis, morphogenetic fields, come from trying to understand how it is that, you know, living organisms get the shapes that they have, how they grow into the shapes that they're meant to grow into, whether there's like a blueprint or something that they follow. And he also leans towards a more of an organismic model of the cosmos. He talks about natural laws as habits and things like that, as if the cosmos is a kind of a living organism that slowly and gradually changes over time. So we've got two strands then within parapsychology. One is reductionist and mechanistic, and the other one is more organic, biologically based maybe. So what I want to do, I don't know how long I've got left. What I want to do is think about, just very quickly, what it would be like to apply some ecological or biological or organismic principles to the paranormal. And like I said before, I want to do that by applying it to some of my own experiences with mediumship.
Jack?
Yeah?
If I may, you got about 40 minutes left.
Sweet, that's great. Okay, so the first principle that I want to talk about is growth, or, you know, development, or the idea of process, so that things kind of change over time, basically. The second principle I want to think about is symbiosis. And the third principle is a bit broader, a bit broader than those two, is the idea of systems, holism, and complexity. So these are the three I'm going to go through now and apply these three principles to mediumship broadly. So just in case anyone doesn't know, my PhD research was with spirit mediums in Bristol, a place called the Bristol Spirit Lodge. And I've got my kind of ethnographic monograph, or whatever you want to call it, coming out in a few months' time, which kind of encapsulates all of my experience in the field and my attempts to make sense of it. But this organismic way of thinking has only relatively recently started to come into the picture with me. Although I think actually a lot of the things that I've been talking about in the past have related to it as well, but now it's becoming really clear. And I'm rethinking my experiences with mediumship development and in seances, you know, through a lens of organicism, to see if it helps to make sense of it. So let's think about it now in terms of how we might apply a principle of growth, development, and process. Okay, so we know obviously that these are features of all living things. You know, when we're doing biology in high school, we get taught, you know, the basic characteristics of living things, and growth is one of them. You know, whether we're talking about single-celled organisms or human beings, you know, multicellular organisms, we all grow and change over time, and we all, you know, decay as well and die. So rather than, let's think about how we could apply this to mediumship. Rather than understanding spirit mediumship in terms of, tuning in like a radio, why couldn't we instead think of it in terms of organic processes like growth, and also the idea of process in general, that it's not like you just tune into a station and then you've got it definitively there, but it's more like a spectrum, or a it's a gradual process that builds up over time. So Edith Turner, Anthropologist, gives a really interesting example of how the idea of, growth, or she goes to the extent of talking about carving, or, birth, in the context of understanding the Hamburger Ritual that she experienced in the 1980s. I've talked about this a lot before, but the Hamburger Ritual is basically a ceremony to extract a negative spirit from the body of an afflicted individual. And she describes in detail how she goes through these motions of participating emotionally in the ritual, and there are kind of like ebbs and flows of intensity, but it slowly builds up over, hours and hours and hours. And eventually she feels, and the group feels, a sense that something is about to be born, or something is about to manifest, or there's going to be some kind of a shift. And she says, it feels like something is about to be carved, like a baby cow is going to be born. And then at the climax of the ritual, she sees this ectoplasmic kind of like gray plasma thing extracted from the back of the afflicted patient. So, the idea that it is more of a kind of a birthing process, I think, is quite interesting. And if you apply that then to seances and mediumship development, like the kind of thing that I experienced, then seances become almost like, mini birthing processes for spirits that take time. Just another thing that I wanted to add in here, this idea of it being a birthing process. I don't know if anyone's ever been to a mediumship development session, but in my experience, the spirits can take weeks or months even to develop into fully communicating entities. And the circle leader kind of picks up on subtle movements in the body of the medium, picks them out and kind of focuses in on them. So, like if the medium twitches, then it's the presence of a spirit. So it's kind of like a teasing out process. You look for clues in the physical body of the medium, and then they kind of nurture it over time until eventually, a fully communicable spirit entity emerges. So the point I'm trying to get at here is, if we apply the technological metaphor and think of the medium as a tuner or receiver, then it's like we're tuning into something that's definitely there, like in that particular moment, and we get through, we've got a clear signal. Whereas if you look at it from the more kind of organismic, processual kind of, birthing and growth perspective, then, essentially developments, mediumship development is like growing spirits in a way, which is interesting. I don't know what the wider implications of it are, but it's definitely, a different way of thinking about mediumship development. Okay. The second thing I want to think about, second principle, is the idea of symbiotic relationships. Something's gone weird with my slides here. So Lynn Margulis was one of the co-creators of the Gaia hypothesis with James Lovelock. We'll talk a little bit about Gaia hypothesis later. But she suggested, and she became quite famous for this suggestion, and also, attracted a lot of criticism from establishment biology, that her suggestion was that symbiosis and collaboration between organisms is also a fundamental organic principle. So when we think about the way that we usually understand evolution, it's like survival of the fittest, got individuals competing against each other. Well, when we look at the natural world, we also see, symbiosis, organisms that live, in harmony with each other, but harmony in inverted commas. There's also the other extreme with parasitism as well, parasites. And I think this is just one little caveat to this. I don't want to make it seem as though I'm presenting a rose-tinted view of ecology. There are also, things that we could consider like negative principles of ecology as well, which could equally be applied. Things like death and predation and all of that kind of stuff. And certainly in the context of, spirit possession and all that kind of stuff, then the parasite model seems to work. But anyway, symbiosis is a positive thing as well. Collaboration between organisms is pretty interesting. And mycorrhizal fungi are perhaps, one of the best examples of this kind of symbiotic relationship in the natural world. Mycorrhizal fungi are essentially a kind of fungus that attaches itself to the root system of plants and trees. And it's a reciprocal relationship, mutually beneficial, because fungus can't photosynthesize, so it needs sugars, it needs to get sugars from somewhere. And the plants need access to nutrients and water. So the fungus provides the plants with access to a broader network, more water and nutrients by extending the root system. And then the fungus in return gets sugars from the plant, which it produces through photosynthesis. So it's kind of like a mutually beneficial relationship. This is what a symbiosis is. And there's also lots of interesting stuff recently about these networks in the soil connecting plants and how they might be used for electrical message signaling and all of that kind of stuff, which is all super interesting as well. So again, let's try and think about how this symbiotic view might be applied to the paranormal and to mediumship. So mycorrhizal fungi are liminal entities. They exist, between, the mycelium or the network exists between the fungus and the root system. So it's liminal, it's between places. So what happens then if we apply this idea to similar classically problematic issues like the mind-body relationship, for example? So, if we have the mind-body relationship and we approach it from a symbiotic perspective, then, the dualistic perspective obviously is that mind and body are two separate things, that they can't, there's something totally different about them. Whereas a symbiotic perspective would suggest that actually in some way they are, interconnected. Mind and body might be mutually related. So, apply it to spirit possession, then the spirits are actually symbiotic, living liminal entities that are manifested through the physical bodies of mediums, which is a pretty interesting way of thinking about it. Yeah, if that makes sense. So, could mind and matter be symbiotically related to each other? Could the physical performances of mediums also be the spiritual manifestation of non-physical beings? Maybe. Spirits are liminal entities. Well, we know that they are, but maybe we can use the model of other kind of, liminal entities that are not a challenge to science to kind of, super extend it like Hans Driesch said, and think about spirits in that kind of way, maybe. Okay, and then the third really big principle is the idea of systems, holism, and complexity. So in ecological science, the ecosystem is probably, probably the most famous idea, but it's also probably the most important. This is just a very simple, illustration of an ecosystem, but you can see that everything is interconnected. In the real world, all of these different interconnected systems are connected with each other as well. So it's like a, infinitely complex relationships between all of the various different kinds of elements and organisms and all of that kind of stuff. So the chief and the overall worldview that you can take away from ecology is of an interconnected world. You can extend that out into the cosmos as well. So there we go. Ecosystems consist of relationships between living organisms and also between organisms in the non-physical environment. And if you get a chance to have a look at, check out a video about trophic cascades by George Monbiot, where he describes how the reintroduction of wolves in Yellowstone National Park in the 90s actually had the effect of stabilizing rivers. So there's even relationships within ecosystems between, things that we would consider inanimate in the West, like rivers, and living organisms like wolves, which we would not think there was any connection. But because of the way that energy cascades through systems and the interactions, those kind of effects occur. Okay, so they're we can think of those in a way as like emergent complexity, emergent effects, that kind of stuff. If you have complex systems, then you have complex effects. One thing that's really interesting about ecosystems is that they tend towards increased complexity and increased diversity. So, there was a biologist called Frederick Clements, and he talked about, his idea was succession, and he thought of succession as kind of like the process by which communities of plants, for example, mature into, he called them like superorganisms. Like a forest is a superorganism, is a community of different kinds of trees that all work together to ultimately to change the environment, the atmosphere, the air content and everything inside woodlands is different to outside of woodlands and all of that kind of stuff. So through the process of succession, ultimately you get to these incredibly complex, highly biodiverse systems. And, like the Amazon rainforest is the prime example. There's so many connections between different species going on there. That's kind of where nature generally trends towards. Okay, it's actually quite a controversial idea in ecology as well, because, as in all branches of science, there are backwards and forwards between, people who want to take a more reductionist view and people who want to take a more holistic view. But, succession is an ecological principle. People still debate it though. Okay, so really what ecology requires of us is this holistic perspective where we understand, organisms, not in terms of being like individual entities, but in terms of the relationships that they're engaged in with different kinds of species. So if we want to take an ecological perspective on the paranormal, for example, then we have to embrace complexity. So we apply it to mediumship. Mediumistic experiences and phenomena, we could say, occur within a matrix of different kinds of processes, loads of different kinds of processes, like physiological processes, brain state changes, sweating and all of that kind of stuff, and psychological processes, like the things that the mediums are thinking about and all that kind of stuff, social processes, like in anthropology, I tried to explain spirit possession in terms of social functions. Well, I'm not saying that those things don't happen, but they're only part of the picture. And then there's also the possibility of psi, and transpersonal, other kinds of processes that are going on as well. So what it means then is that, when we're trying to understand a seance or a mediumistic demonstration, we can't really remove it from this wider context, which is what people generally tend to do. They want to understand, for example, whether it's true or false, So they're automatically reducing something that's really complex into a binary distinction, which doesn't necessarily work. And what it also does is it opens up the possibility for, like I was saying before, kind of like emergent phenomena that, at the end of the day, the seance can't be reduced to any of its constituent parts. It's not satisfactory to say that, to explain the seance purely in terms of social functions or purely in terms of brain states or forms or symbols or any of that kind of stuff, when actually all of those different processes are going on simultaneously. So it's very complex. And ultimately that means then, if we apply this kind of perspective, the seance is more than the sum of its parts. So, like I was saying, there are psychological processes, there are cognitive processes involved, there's social dynamics, there's all of that kind of stuff, and then there's more as well. And when all of those things come together in like the perfect storm, then maybe in some way, spirits or whatever, those manifest. Okay, so that's me applying 3 different principles to mediumship to show how maybe organicism might present some novel new ways of thinking about the paranormal. And what I want to do very quickly now is just to think about some other ecological dimensions to the paranormal. And they are this, there seems to be something to do with observing and interacting with nature. Okay, so people who engage with nature, observe it and interact with it, seem to have more extraordinary experiences. But there also seems to be a connection between extraordinary experiences and actually wanting to participate in nature as well. So there's an interesting feedback loop there that I want to briefly talk about. And I also want to think about the non-human world, which is revealed through both ecology and, anomalistics. So first, observe and interact. So if I look at my experiences with mediumship development, what it revealed was a process of nurturing the spirits, like I was saying before, an organic kind of like a birthing process. And really what this is a process of engagement and interaction. So like I was saying, they pick up on little minute details, focus in on it, and eventually over time build up a spirit presence. So it's an observational and an interactive process, mediumship development. And there's also a lot of interesting evidence to suggest that people who, go outdoors and who go to wilderness locations and do all of these kinds of things have mystical peak experiences and all that kind of stuff. There's a classic, in the study of mysticism, there's a classic kind of mystical experience, which is, where you're projecting out into the world, that you feel as though you're a part of the world. So people and a lot of people who have those experiences have them in wilderness locations. So there seems to be something to do with the way that we observe and interact with the natural world that gives rise to extraordinary experiences. There we go. So engagement with ecology can actually lead to extraordinary experiences. And I did a little bit of research with permaculture practitioners who, permaculture is an ecological design process. It's basically like gardening, but it extends out into other spheres as well. And I did find, not everyone, but some people who spend a lot of time in their gardens, they will engage with the plants and things, and they will experience things that, from a mainstream, Western materialist scientific perspective are not possible, like communication with plants and that kind of thing. And then there's another aspect of it as well, which is where extraordinary experiences seem to often carry an ecological message. So there's just one example from John Mack in his research into alien abductions. But this applies to near-death experiences as well, and all sorts of different kinds of paranormal experiences. He says, it seems impossible to avoid the observation that the alien abduction phenomenon is occurring in the context of a planetary ecological crisis that is reaching critical proportions, and that information about this situation is often powerfully conveyed by the alien beings to the experiences. So I don't want to get into, thinking about what are the motivations of the aliens and all that kind of stuff, which, someone's going to have to think about. But it's just interesting that extraordinary experiences across the spectrum, from alien abductions to near-death experiences and all the rest, often leave the experiencer feeling as though they're part of the world again. They realize their place in the cosmos. It can be a frightening experience because they realize that there are actually predators out there that are bigger than us, for example. But yeah, so it's a two-way thing. If we engage with the world, we have extraordinary experiences, but if we have extraordinary experiences, it can also encourage us to re-engage with the world. And I think there's something in that can be explored. Okay, very briefly, if we take the paranormal as a whole world view, we've got aliens, Bigfoot, ghosts, all different kinds of spirits, Loch Ness Monster, different kinds of magical beings and entities, fairies and stuff. We've also got mind-to-mind communication and all of that kind of stuff. If we think about this, from an anthropological perspective and a comparative perspective, then what we've really got is another form of animism. The idea that the world is populated by minds, different kinds of entities and beings that we can engage in relationships with. Okay, so the paranormal world reveals a world full of non-human minds, and so does the world of ecology and biology and all of that kind of stuff. So you might have seen Mike Clelland's interesting stuff on the links between UFOs and owls, for example, which is really interesting. But actually, there are lots of traditions of animals as spirit beings and all that kind of stuff as well. There's magical encounters with toads and things like that. Fungi, all of the wonderful weirdness of fungi, pretty crazy stuff. The mycelial networks and all of that. People like Paul Stamets have suggested that the mycelial network might be like, a substrate for consciousness because of all the very complex connections. It's like a brain almost. And then we've got people like Monica Gagliano, who's doing these amazing experiments which demonstrate that plants actually have the capacity to learn, which implies that they also have the capacity for memory and all of these kind of things. Also interesting research on plants communicating with each other with sound, stuff that we've assumed were like animal, higher order animal things being detected in plants. So slowly, ecology, biology, sciences are also revealing, like paranormal, that the world is full of different kinds of minds, plant minds, animal minds, and maybe even also eventually rock minds and things like that. And like I was saying, if we take all of this together, it kind of implies an animistic worldview. And Graham Harvey, scholar of religion, gives a really useful animism that I like, and I think it's much better than older kind of definitions that were loaded with colonialist ideas and imperialist ideas about primitive cultures and all that kind of stuff. Graham Harvey's, he's moved beyond that. So animists are people who recognize that the world is full of persons, only some of whom are human, and that life has always lived in relationship with others. Animism is lived out in various ways that are all about learning to act respectfully, carefully, and constructively towards and among other persons. Persons are beings rather than objects who are animated and social towards others, even if they are not always sociable. Animism is more accurately understood as being concerned with learning how to be a good person in respectful relationship with other persons. Okay, so, and this is the kind of the framework. I mean, it's not to say that every culture, indigenous societies around the world have the same beliefs or anything like that, but there are kind of animistic tendencies in many of the world's indigenous traditions, and also in if we look back into Western and European traditions as well, sure enough we find animism there. So it just seems strange, in the last, let's be generous and say like 500 years or whatever since the Enlightenment and all of that kind of stuff, that we've moved in this increasingly technological kind of direction, increasingly individualistic ways of thinking, and we have ended up in the sixth mass extinction. So perhaps there is something to be learned from animistic traditions, but also by tapping into our own kind of like our paranormal and folkloric thing that's going on, our supernatural beings that live in the lakes and things like that. They are our animistic worldview waiting for us to reclaim them in a way. So just to kind of wrap up, I want to think about how actually, even something like paranormal research can help us to tackle the ecological crisis. It's not something that we would naturally, not two things that we would naturally bring together, ecology and the paranormal, but I think there are, hopefully I've shown some of them, but I think there are lots and lots of these threads that run throughout it, like a mycelial network. Okay, so broadly speaking now, this organismic and ecological perspective reveals that we are part of the world, that human beings are part of the things that are going on around us. We can't extract ourselves from the system. And that's useful for thinking about parapsychology as well. Parapsychologists have been trying to make experiments to rule people out of situations when in fact we're all, even experimenters, are already in the system and part of it. And ecology really drives that home. So, everything that we do has an effect. And it's also clear that the more that we engage with the world, the more we open ourselves up to extraordinary experiences, interactions with toads and things like that, interactions with plants. And, perhaps there is something more to that, perhaps we are tapping into something. And it opens us up to an awareness of the non-human, all of these other different kinds of minds that surround us. And then, like I was saying, extraordinary experiences seem to reconnect us with the world in some way. There's lots of interesting research going on, with psychedelics and things and nature connection and how we might be able to, tune ourselves, well, not tune ourselves in the wrong kind of metaphor, but whatever, get in touch with nature. And maybe this can be a feedback loop for positive action, maybe in some way. And then the last thing I just want to think about is this idea of biodiversity also being a form of psychodiversity. So, like I was just saying about, plant consciousness and toads and frogs and newts and owls and all of these different kinds of animals and foxes and everything. When we have an ecosystem, a biodiverse place, then it's also psychodiverse. It's also full of lots of different kinds of ways of thinking and ways of being in the world. And so if we think about this idea and super extend it, then maybe it's not so surprising that there might be, spirits, and in fact there are spirits in animal form, for example, non-human consciousness. So, it just makes things seem to fit together quite nicely. Okay, so I hope that wasn't too garbled. If you are interested in exploring some of these connections further, then you can check out this book, Greening the Paranormal. It's got chapters from a range of different contributors, and they all explore different dimensions of the relationship between ecology and the paranormal. So that, there's stuff in there from like anthropological perspectives, there's parapsychological point of view, cryptozoology, indigenous perspectives, the relationship, the role of psychedelics and all of that kind of stuff. And then if you were really interested and wanted to take it a step further again, then I'm currently rejigging the master's course in ecology and spirituality for University of Wales, Trinity St David, and it's open for registrations at the moment, and it's kicking off in October. But this is a master's level course that explores the relationships between ecology and spirituality from a variety of different perspectives. So it's going to be academic and critical, but it's going to be broad and interesting. It's an opportunity to delve deeper into these things and lots of other stuff. And it's taught online through the Sophia Center. So, in this kind of like post-COVID world, online teaching is pretty good. It's a way to go. So something to think about. And then there's some references. You'll notice that my references are all to